Biological Riley presents a Thingy McDongle. Howdy y'all, welcome to the show. It is I, Mrs. Frumple-Dumple, and today we are diving back in to Stranger Things 4. In fact, today's video is the second part of my video essay series discussing how Stranger Things 4 handles themes involving post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But before we start this essay proper, let me first state that there is a content warning. This video essay covers post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma, mental health at large, hospital stays, mass shootings, and suicide. Yes, we talk about a lot of heavy stuff today, so if you're not in the right place mentally, or if these things are potentially triggering for you, you might want to skip this video for now. You can always come back to it later. Additionally, I just want to warn you, there will be spoilers in this video, so if you haven't watched the show yet and wish to remain unspoiled, then you might want to hold off on this video essay for that reason as well. And that's it, no more warnings, you know how my videos work, so without further ado, here is the second part of my video essay series about Stranger Things 4 and PTSD. Part 2. Meanwhile, do you remember Elle? With how little we talked about her on the previous part of this video essay, you might have believed that I did not view her plotline as being critical to the story, that she was not as important as my flame-haired firstborn. But au contraire, Elle is actually very relevant to the PTSD and mental health themes, is a very complementary piece to Max's narrative, and adds further context to the main story, the A-plot, if you will. To summarize, Elle starts season 4 in a rough place. After the events of season 3, where her surrogate father Hopper sacrificed himself to save Hawkins, Elle lost her telekinetic abilities and moved to California with Joyce, Will, and Jonathan, and had been there for roughly a year. Being away from Hawkins, being away from her doof of a boyfriend, Mike, she was alone. Or at least that was the case until the narrative kicks into motion. Because screenwriting. Due to reasons of plot, Elle is taken in by authorities who warn her about the danger posed to Hawkins, which we now know to be Vecna, and how she has the best chance that the world has of defeating that said threat. And in order to do this, Elle must travel to a secret facility and undergo some mental exercises and grapple with some past traumas of which are currently mentally blocking and preventing her from accessing her telekinetic abilities. You know, the powers that she needs to use in order to stand a chance against Vecna that can now only be unlocked through extensive treatment. In other words, Elle is going to superhero rehab. And yes, I know I phrased that quite humorously, if I do say so myself, but it's honestly not a joke though. Like when her longtime former prisoner and tormentor Dr. Brenner, because of course he's spearheading this telekinetic restoration crusade, lays out Elle's treatment plan, he compares her to a stroke victim. He mentions in detail how stroke victims must reacquaint themselves with average daily functions that were once easy and non-notable to them, because now, post-stroke, these victims could not do those activities anymore without extensive treatment. And Elle is similar to them. Elle must repair internal damage and confront her trauma in order to heal herself, which in the case of this science fiction fantasy horror show means being able to lift cars with her mind, and for that reason, she must, in essence, go to therapy. This is a topic that I understand all too well. After all, Elle has basically been hospitalized here, and that's something I understand on a fundamental level. As a personal catastrophe myself, I've undergone plenty of inpatient stays at hospitals and intensive outpatient excursions when my mental health and PTSD hit rock bottom. If anything, I know what it's like to be checked into a facility and do a bunch of therapy like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and etc., and have to retrain myself on how to actually function in everyday life. Because, make no mistake, this is my element. I know this shit. And when watching Elle's comparable hospitalization, I could immediately imagine how she felt, because I know what it's like to be hospitalized. Our situations are just very comparable here. Well, minus the telekinesis and the fact that a third party footed Elle's entire medical bill at this state-of-the-art facility, rather than having her make her way through the labyrinthine quagmire of expensive health insurance premiums, copays, and deductibles. Because wow, it must be really nice being one of God's chosen. I'm not jealous at all. Elle begins her hospitalization journey like how many others do, by the order of Dr. Brenner, who I am going to refer to as Dr. Dipshit for a while, for he is both a doctor and a dipshit. Elle is essentially locked in, guarded to prevent any escape attempts, and is cut off from contacting any of her outside friends, including her boyfriend Mike. Though, let's be honest, Mike could probably use some time at Disneyland anyway. The way he's dressed, he's probably already halfway there. But the most important thing that Elle feels at the start is the sensation of loss, where she realized that being in this place means that she has fallen off the wagon. And that's a feeling that I can personally relate to. Like, speaking for myself, someone who has been hospitalized many times and have made plenty of Airbnb reservations at these hop-in joints, entering a hospital is a lot like this. A patient is admitted into the facility. They are lost, confused, and in pain. The time they spent on the outside was unproductive, some of the choices they made were toxic and self-destructive, and everything that happened prior to walking into this facility, every choice they made, has led them here, to this specific place. And then it hits them. Wow, how fucking far have I fallen? Admittedly, this is part of the negative self-talk that is omnipresent within mentally ill folks. After all, hospitals are actually good and necessary, and no one should feel bad about receiving treatment and care if they are hurting or if they are, mentally speaking, in a bad place. People do have legitimate mental illnesses, and due to stigma, lack of finances, or a multitude of other reasons, these conditions are all too often neglected until the afflicted mentally ill person is in a red alert, all hands on deck, the captain choked on a Cobb salad style of crisis and desperately needs a hospital to recuperate. These places, while imperfect in our for-profit capitalist system, are good. They are important for people that are in the midst of a mental health crisis. But with that said, I'm not explaining the logic here. I'm just describing how a patient like Elle feels in this type of situation. Because when someone enters a hospital in a state of emotional disrepair, their thinking is skewed. Their judgment of the situation is flawed. They are not mentally well after all. And Elle is the same, but with a science fiction superpower bent. When she first sees Dr. Dipshit strutting down an overly dramatic staircase, one of her first impulses was to run away. Hell, she even tries to escape. Twice. And while deep down Elle knows that she needs this treatment in order to be a badass hero again, that said treatment plan is daunting. She feels overwhelmed. Furthermore, Elle's therapy and treatment plan frightens her at first. To start, she lays down in a machine that can only be described as amnesia cerebral, which has the function of allowing her to relive past volatile memories from her early childhood, the ones that she blacked out from her consciousness due to how they were traumatic in nature, but needs to re-experience in order to unlock her telekinetic abilities. The agonizing memories taking place back when she was Dr. Dipshit's prisoner at the secret child abduction facility in Hawkins. And this treatment unfortunately hits Elle very hard, especially seeing as she was unaware that she was in the memory tank in her first go-around, because of course Dr. Dipshit placed her in the container while she was unconscious. And when taking stock of her surroundings at first, Elle feels like she has personally regressed and that she is starting back at square one. Hell, she even has a breakdown, which only makes sense. After all, she associates this place with pain. The rainbow walls, her hospital gown, the oppressive fluorescent lighting, and etc. all harken back to a dark time in Elle's life. Yet the biggest point of contention for Elle was the fact that she didn't have her long hair anymore, that she now sported a buzz cut like she did back in the old days, which is something that fills Elle with incredible sorrow. See, hair is symbolic for Elle. Back when she was imprisoned in Hawkins, she was never allowed to grow her hair out. She was honestly denied that small yet notable personal choice. But ever since Elle escaped Dr. Dipshit's Charles Xavier facility back in season 1 and met Mike, Dustin, Hopper, and etc., Elle let her hair grow out, symbolizing her freedom and growth as a person. Yet now that Elle is reliving these old memories, she realizes that she doesn't have long hair anymore, because as stated before, she wasn't allowed to grow out her lovely locks back then, and add on the fact that Dr. Dipshit and company cut her hair outside of the tank back in reality, Elle's realization that her hair was short again was downright demoralizing for her. Because let's be clear, Elle had battled hard for her freedom. She fought for it. She bled for it. She even dates this goober for it. Yet now here she is. Like so many people who are hospitalized in real life, she has hit a Pink Floyd-sized brick wall. Her trauma is literally debilitating and preventing her from being the best version of herself that she can possibly be, and that sad fact has stunted her. And with that, symbolized by a haircut, Elle is back where she started, alone and trapped, and for her the only way out is through the fire and the flames of the recovery process. Elle must proceed with the treatment plan. Elle eventually agrees to work her way through the therapy treatment, all despite the fact that it is not guaranteed to work. Even though reliving these past memories is painful to Elle, she reluctantly agrees to re-experience her tumultuous past, echoing how mentally ill patients in a mental health facility hash out their traumatic past events and problems through various doctor-prescribed regimens. They choose to become vulnerable in the hopes that they can heal themselves. And like Elle, there's no inherent guarantee that these patients will one day be the same person that they used to be. Though let's be clear that in terms of the mentally ill, there's strong scientific evidence that the various treatments and therapies that are introduced at many mental health facilities are overall beneficial. It's just that the mileage varies depending on whether or not a patient is open to the treatment. In a hospital setting, the person afflicted with trauma or a mental illness is provided with the necessary tools that can aid them in the recovery process. But with that said, that same aforementioned patient has to actively choose to utilize these skills and treatments. The various skills and treatments that give the patient a fighting chance. And honestly, a hospital is critically important for that reason alone. Elle's journey at the facility reflects the experiences of real-life mentally ill people, albeit it's a representation with a slick science fiction coat of paint. Like me and many others who have spent time in a hospital, Elle is attempting to process all of her traumatic experiences in a constructive way, also that she can function as the Elle that we know and love again. She is trying to repair her mind, which, similar to reality, is ultimately the point of going to a hospital and undergoing therapy in the first place. Elle's recovery process and progress is relatable. Over the course of her therapy, Elle slowly but surely regains access to her telekinetic prowess. Not all at once or immediately as powerful as before, but she does make progress towards her end goal. You know, baby shark steps, which is generally how treatment works in a hospital. After all, mentally ill folks do not just magically heal and become whole again after receiving a diagnosis or get prescribed meds, though of course those things can help. Instead, hospitals also reteach healthy and productive habits that may have fallen to an ill person's wayside. Things like self-care, socialization, and good hygiene. You know, brush your teeth, take a shower, clean your room, maybe pick up the phone when your dad's calling you. But let's not ask too much here. And yes, I know that to many people, the importance of doing these activities is more obvious than the messaging of an Aaron Sorkin script. But when someone's ill, when someone's in deep emotional anguish, they become preoccupied on these tumultuous mental turbulences to the point that they don't care to restart healthy habits like showering or setting a schedule. They overlook important daily chores that become lost amidst a long-term mental health crisis, which is a difficult mind state to reprogram. But as befitting of Dr. Dipshit's aforementioned stroke metaphor, actively doing these chores actually does help rebuild productive habits that more or less heal the brain. In fact, they install good patterns that are conducive to a healthy lifestyle. Because even when a mentally ill person does something as simple as making their bed, it can fill them with a sense of accomplishment. They think, holy shit, I can do things, which is a big confidence boost that allows those same people to go on and do other activities throughout their day that will further aid them in their efforts to repair their psyche and help install better habits that they had once abandoned back when their mental health began to spiral out of control. Like Elle, they are essentially fixing their mind little by little here. This eventually leads into more complex therapies that can tangibly repair one's functionality and mental health, the type of activities that really reflect Elle's arc in the show. For one thing, physical exercise is important for those with mental illness or PTSD, mostly because the cross-lateral movement can help open up various underused neural pathways, mindfulness can help calm an overactive mind, and art therapy and journaling deliver an outlet that was otherwise absent, which, to be honest, is what this video essay is, by the way. Like, let's not beat around the bush here. I'm using a creative avenue to hash out my current mental health issues and PTSD struggles. Honestly, it's how I'm coping right now, alongside the occasional Italian beef with mozzarella cheese and hot peppers, because it's delicious even though it transforms my asshole into a damn flamethrower. But I digress. However, the most relevant therapies pertaining to the topic of this video are CBT and DBT, or rather cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy, which are therapies that allow mentally ill folks to grapple and process complicated and often distressing thoughts and past traumatic baggage in healthy ways. With these therapies, psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists essentially train and condition patients' minds in order for them to handle dark, depressing concepts and conflictive real-world scenarios that once would have mentally decommissioned them. They are the hardest, yet among the most important non-medication treatments a patient can receive in a hospital. DBT and CBT are very proactive therapies and can nip traumatic episodes and distressing thoughts in the bud the more a patient trains with them. It's basically the mental health equivalent of leveling up a Pokemon. And honestly, these real-life therapies encapsulate Elle's mental deep dives into Dr. Dipshit's medical cocoon quite succinctly. If anything, she is confronting some deep and literally debilitating past trauma and strengthening herself to surmount it, all while becoming stronger every time she practices. It is akin to DBT and CBT, but with a science fiction flair. Eventually, Elle successfully burrows through her past traumatic events and regains her powers. Through the amnesia tank, Elle relives old painful memories about her imprisonment at the Hawkins facility that she had cordoned off from her conscious mind years prior. In these memories, she was manipulated by a hospital aide named Henry, who is trapped there against his will and is tracked via a microchip. And together, Henry teaches Elle, someone who he sees great potential in, how to best harness her abilities, all while sowing distrust and undermining the authority of Dr. Brenner. Side note, I'm not calling him Dr. Dipshit anymore because that joke has run its damn course. It is dead to me. All to the point that Elle destroys Henry's tracking chip so that they can escape the Hawkins facility together. But this is bad, because the tracking chip additionally acted as a neural inhibitor. See, in a twist, we learned that Henry is an incredibly powerful yet psychotically deranged telepath. In fact, he was the young son of the earlier aforementioned Creel family, who was actually their killer and tormentor. And now with the inhibitor gone, Henry massacres the vast majority of the facility staff and patients, all before Elle confronts him and ultimately triumphs in a strong battle of wills, where she telepathically yeets him into the Upside Down, where he is sent tumbling into the dark, cloudy, and lightning-filled abyss, a journey that physically scars him via lightning burns akin to Emperor Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith. His soul is cooked medium well, and from there Henry becomes the being that we now know to be as Vecna. Elle's treatment was a resounding medical success, paralleling how various therapies aid real-life mentally ill folks and PTSD victims in a hospital. Elle, like many hospitalized folks, entered the facility in shambles. She was broken, defeated, and just not in the best of places, but after the treatment she can now tap into her abilities again, meaning that she can now bench press multi-ton machines and chuck military-grade choppers like a champ. As advertised, the therapy restored her telekinetic capabilities. But with that said, Elle underwent an emotional journey separate from her deep dive into the memory tank this season. In fact, at season 4's beginning, Elle admittedly still had a fair bit of problems to give to her mental QA department. See, Elle's traumatic past events prevent her from fitting in. At the start of the season, Elle struggles to make friends and socialize, mostly because her history of being more or less an incarcerated lab rat meant that she was never able to develop those types of skills. Like a small-time YouTuber being smashed beneath the over-encumbering weight of the mighty algorithm, that's my excuse, that's what I'm rolling with, her past trauma is literally blunting any future personal growth. And due to this, Elle ponders whether or not she is a monster, a creature deserving of such horrific treatment, because as stated in part 1 of this essay, PTSD victims often blame themselves. Because, of course, the persistent asshole that is negative self-talk strikes again here. It's basically the cognitive equivalent of the Hamburglar. It never stops with its nonsensical bullshit. And due to this, Elle blames herself on how she's unable to operate like the typical quote-unquote normal human. She believes that she is a monster, that she is less than human. But Elle's experience in the tank changes her mind, as exemplified by the events following her reacquisition of her powers. Given that Elle has now been restored to her full capabilities, she is game to assist her friends back in Hawkins, lest they battle this loogie of the Black Lagoon without the aid of her telepathic air support. But things take a dark turn fast. When Elle regained her powers, she was offered a choice from the two people who were the main support of her rehabilitation, i.e. the aforementioned Dr. Brenner and the nicer, more democratic Dr. Sam Owens. Brenner desires for Elle to remain at the facility for further training, whilst Owens believes that Elle should make her own decisions, viewing this as a therapy to restore her powers rather than an imprisonment like the one she had faced at Brenner's hands before. And to wit, Elle chose to help save her friends and fight Vecna, yet unfortunately Elle is betrayed before she leaves. Brenner, who, let's be clear, is also representative of a parent abusing their child, forbids Elle from leaving, denying her own personal choice, which inspires a very emotional speech from Elle where she states that Brenner is the actual monster rather than herself, that he is in the wrong rather than her, which is ultimately correct. She ain't wrong. She's spittin' truths like how Corey Taylor spits out heavy metal raps. But of course, Brenner disagrees, and they eventually all get into an altercation, one where the conniving Brenner gets the upper hand, incapacitates both Elle and Dr. Owens, and snaps a superpower inhibiting collar around Elle's neck. She is a prisoner now. In other words, Brenner doesn't treat her as a person. Elle is chained up like the monster she once feared herself to be. Admittedly, I was initially confused by this plot development on a thematic level. After all, the show went through painstaking efforts to portray trauma via Max's, Elle's, and Hopper's character arcs, and with Elle's narrative in particular, there were a lot of parallels with how folks with PTSD and mental illness receive treatment at a mental health facility. Yet, Elle's imprisonment undermines this artistic interpretation at first glance, mostly because once a patient becomes stable, doctors and medical staff don't keep patients at a hospital indefinitely against their will any longer than strictly necessary, especially in a for-profit healthcare system. After all, every day a patient stays at a facility costs money, particularly if a patient is uninsured and possibly will never pay them back, meaning that a hospital would never permanently imprison them. Hell, if that patient is in a hospital ER but doesn't have insurance for that said hospital's mental health facilities, the hospital might make the patient wait overnight in the most uncomfortable, isolated room that has ever existed, only for them to ship the patient out to a different hospital via an ambulance that they later billed them $900 for. And no, I'm not speaking from experience. I don't have a grudge. I don't have an axe to grind. I'm not fucking Gimli. I never thought I'd say that in a sentence. What I'm trying to say is that an inpatient facility would never keep patients long term, unless of course it's one of those repurposed mental health asylums that are very rare but still do exist in modernity, or if someone was placed into a long-term psychiatric facility by court order. And with that, I was originally perplexed by Stranger Things 4's messaging surrounding Elle's imprisonment. I first thought that the show traded its thematic purpose in exchange for narrative expediency during this specific narrative thread, but I was wrong. In fact, the more I think about it, there actually is a salient narrative and thematic interpretation regarding PTSD and mental health care that actually works here. One that is actually very heart-wrenching. One that ties Elle's PTSD-infused fear that she is a monster with how she is incarcerated. A reason that shows how the US government and healthcare system often fails the mentally ill. See, in real life, mental illness has a stigma. People often view the mentally ill without a sense of compassion or understanding. Some view us as a problem, or even worse, a threat. And due to this lack of empathy, our healthcare system, and quite frankly, most of our government systems, actively fail the mentally ill. In the United States, roughly 1/3 of the homeless population have a mental illness, many mentally ill folks turn to substance abuse and drugs to cope, and roughly 1/4 of the mentally ill population live below the poverty line, meaning many can't afford the prohibitive cost of mental health care, as well as the fact that marginalized communities are hit particularly hard. And seeing as homelessness has a lot of rules and stipulation that when broken can lead to jail time, and drug possession is often criminalized because, thanks Nixon, you inhumane fuck. This means many mentally ill folks are incarcerated at an alarming rate. In fact, roughly 43% of inmates in state prisons have a mental illness, and that's, well, not good. It highlights how our institutions, policymakers, and honestly even fellow citizens don't have empathy for the mentally ill, because if they did, the situation wouldn't be so goddamn critical. We could be doing so much damn more. But instead, the mentally ill are viewed as a problem meant to be swept under the rug, neglected at best, and put into the prison system at worst. Hell, during my own hospital stay, I've seen people be discharged from the hospital who went straight into police custody, essentially transitioning from their stay at the hospital into a stay at prison. And honestly, that is an inhumane system. It designates the mentally ill as the other, thus there is something inherently nefarious about people with mental illnesses, including trauma. This is what Elle's imprisonment symbolizes, well, at least via my interpretation. Similar to many real-life folks in crisis due to PTSD or other mental illnesses, Elle's hospital stay transitions into a stay at a prison. Far from being respected as an autonomous human being, Dr. Brenner treats Elle like a caged dog. While sure, Brenner does care about Elle in a twisted sort of way and desires to help her medically, he even views himself as her parental figure and even has her refer to him as Papa as if he's her guardian. God, the saggy balls on this guy. He does undermine Elle's sense of free will, her very humanity. Elle is cuffed, her telekinetic powers are muzzled, and she's referred to as the number 11 rather than her chosen name, Elle. Though admittedly, Dr. Brenner referred to Elle as 11 many episodes prior to actually imprisoning her, which honestly was a good indicator as to where this plot was heading. And by holding her in captivity, Brenner doesn't allow Elle to become her own person, thus limiting her true potential as a human being. She is incarcerated against her will, essentially dehumanized, viewed as a specimen rather than a person, kind of similar to how this asshole views the innocent Victor Creel. And this is clearly not what's best for Elle. It's not the best way to help the mentally ill. This reflects how the mentally ill ill are treated in reality. Similar to Elle, the mentally ill need and deserve care, treatment, and a sympathetic ear, but they are all too often imprisoned where they don't receive the type of care that results in the most optimal outcome. Because whether we are discussing Elle's confinement or how often the mentally ill are imprisoned in reality, being in a place that has stripped a person's freedoms from them is just the worst healthcare setting for anyone who is trying to improve their mental health, because no fucking shit. And quick aside, in terms of real life mentally ill people, let me get real with y'all for a second, because honestly I can already hear plenty of y'all clackety-clacking on your keyboards about how I shouldn't fully empathize with criminals, that these folks shouldn't have done the crime if they couldn't do the time. But that's the type of attitude that believes prison should be used as punishment, that these people, many of whose judgment is skewed by mental illness and are actually non-violent offenders who are more likely to face abuse rather than be the abusers themselves, deserve to be in prison for their crimes, some of which, let me remind you, are bullshit, by the way, instead of instituting a system that actually rehabilitates people, one that actually treats people's problems and eventually allows those said aforementioned people to flourish. But sadly, that's not the system we currently have. Instead, the mentally ill are regularly sent to prison, only adding to their traumas and pain, all to satisfy a criminal justice system doing business as usual that views the mentally ill as less than human, as less than worthy of respect. And that's what Brenner represents to me. Beyond being a child abuser, Brenner personifies an overall system at large that routinely fails mentally ill patients under the guise of caring for them. Even though he does desire to give Elle good treatment, he does so at the expense of her own personal agency. He only sees her as a number, after all, a patient he can hold there against her will, embodying a real-life exploitative system, and one that is in actuality the real monster. Admittedly, some of y'all might believe that this interpretation is a bit of a stretch. After all, there are other themes at play in Elle's arc, like the moral panic angle, trauma caused by a parental figure, and etc., and maybe you might believe that I'm trying to just oversell and emphasize this critical angle, much like how the Field of Dream game oversells baseball tickets, because if you build it, he will come, as long as he can afford the outrageous scalping price. But with all that said, there is a sequence of events here that give this critical interpretation about the mentally ill in prison credence. No relation. Firstly, Elle is arrested early on in the season, which we will discuss a bit more soon enough, and was picked up by Dr. Sam Owens while she was being transported to juvie, i.e. our PTSD-afflicted Supergirl was heading to prison. Secondly, later on, Dr. Owens tells Brenner that Elle's treatment facility is not meant to be a prison, and that Elle can make her own choices, meaning that when Brenner locks Elle up via a retro steampunk Hot Topic chained collar, the facility, in essence, became a prison, and thus Elle became Brenner's prisoner. This critical read works. Thirdly, real-life modern patient facilities, like the ones I've been to many times, are often criticized as having prison-adjacent environments themselves, and these criticisms are fair. While I firmly believe that inpatient facilities have an important place in our healthcare system, that doesn't mean they are immune to legitimate criticism, and sadly, one of those criticisms is how some facilities feel like jails. In some places, patients can't wear their own clothes, the bathrooms don't have doors, patients' rooms contain the same plumbing and furniture that are used in jail cells, and etc. And admittedly, there is a solid reasoning behind these practices. After all, hospitals are removing potential tools that could be used to assist in a potential suicide. But here's the problem. At what cost is this being done? Because I'd argue that treating people like prisoners only makes their mental health problems worse and lessens their overall sense of self-worth. And speaking as someone who has done the hospital rodeo many times before, many people entering a mental health hospital already have critically bad mental health and a low sense of self-worth. It's kind of why they're there. And minimizing a patient's humanity, even under the well-meaning intention of curbing inpatient suicide attempts, is overall a bad idea. It is not a wise decision, and one that is overall pretty controversial and with a lot of conflict. I mean, does a facility treat a patient like an individual, or does a hospital remove a patient's freedoms in order to protect them? It's honestly a big healthcare question, and back to the topic of this video, one that Stranger Things 4 grapples with. Hell, it's accurately represented by Owens and Brenner's argument, that Owens believes Elle should be able to make her own choices, whereas Brenner ultimately decides to snatch Elle's freedom from her. Because once again, the prisoner interpretation fits here. Fourthly, Stranger Things 4 featured a sequence involving an old-style mental health asylum about midway through the season, and I highly doubt that this was an accident, especially seeing as mental health asylums have symbolic meaning in American history, as well as in Batman history. See, before deinstitutionalization, a period in the US where most mental health asylums were slowly but surely phased out of existence in the back half of the 1900s, which, while phrasing things like that makes me feel old as shit, asylums were often criticized for their horrid conditions and as being like prisons themselves, places that denied patients of their individuality. And in Stranger Things 4, we see this denial of personhood in action around mid-season when Nancy and Robin travel to Pennhurst Asylum, a fictitious locale in Indiana that was inspired by an actual asylum that was known as Pennhurst, though the real facility was located in Pennsylvania, which makes sense because, you know, Penn is kind of in the title there. And at the show's version of this location, the asylum's warden is kind of full of himself, and Victor Creel, i.e. the prisoner that inspired Nancy's and Robin's visit, was actually innocent of any wrongdoing. In other words, Stranger Things 4 was laying some thematic groundwork here, some narrative gardening, tasteful thematic hedge trimming, and storytelling lawn maintenance. Because gardening and writing, it's the same fucking thing. What I'm attempting to say here, at least before my ADHD derails this video again, is that Stranger Things 4 carefully introduced the sequence of events in the first half of the season in order to bear narrative and thematic fruit later on. As exemplified by the warden and Creel as a prisoner, the show presented a deeply faulty medical professional and a facility that had imprisoned an innocent person and purveyed that said person to be too dangerous to be let free. He is under their control. And truly, doesn't that just sum up Brenner's treatment of Elle later on in the season? Similar to Victor Creel's detainment, Brenner revokes Elle's autonomy and confines her, excusing his horrid actions as being necessary. Like Pennhurst's warden, Brenner is essentially a glorified jailer but with a clean medical professional presentation, because even dipshits can hide their dipshittiness behind a well-ironed suit. And thus the mental health and prisoner critical interpretation makes a lot of sense here as well. Of course, there are worse culprits out there than Dr. Brenner. While Brenner is indeed a shit skunk, he does at least want to give his patients some semblance of care. He actually believes that he is helping people, even though he himself is actually part of the problem. Because once again, he's an abuser. But still, he's not 100% bad, just mostly bad. Jeff Bezos bad. But unfortunately, some folks don't clear this very low bar that's basically touching the ground, by which I mean government officials who purvey Elle as a threat, entities that view her as a dangerous individual rather than a human being. This can be seen earlier on in the season when Elle is arrested. See, Elle was taken into custody after she hit the popular mean girl Angela in the head with a roller skate, causing a massive concussion and ruining Angela's future yearbook photos for a while. On its own, Elle misbehaved. Clearly, she did something wrong, but there is context here. Elle has constantly been on the receiving end of a lot of in-class and public humiliation from this teenage Pacifica Northwest lookalike. If anything, Angela has made Elle's life and her mental health a living hell, which is impressive seeing as Elle once lived in Indiana, a true hell in its own right. And in an act of pure rage, Elle thwops this whelp across the noggin. Once again, not the wisest decision, but it had an understandable motive, which is why it's so sad that the cops who questioned Elle viewed her as a bad kid from the start. Like, after being arrested, Elle is clearly in a lot of emotional and psychological distress and has anxiety issues stemming from the fact that she has a traumatic past, both in terms of the memories about Henry that she had blocked out at the time, as well as how she was a prisoner at Dr. Brenner's facility. She's someone who clearly needs compassion and empathy so that she can explain and give context, good context that provides an understandable rationale, while of course, once again, still bad, as to why she did what she did, instead of receiving the unsympathetic accusations of a police force who have already determined her to be antagonistic. Because truly, Elle deserved better than the judgmental looks. She deserved better than contempt. She didn't kill anyone here. She just acted on a rage-filled impulse after being publicly and documentedly bullied, and therefore the cops should have done the bare minimum of decency and treat her like a human being. Elle just needed someone who could understand her, someone that could do so much better than these ill-equipped police officers. Elle's poor treatment by the police is analogous to how cops handle mental health crises emergencies in real life. See, in a perfect world, the public would have a specific government service to call if someone was experiencing a psychotic break or was having a mental illness-infused episode. When these things would happen, the public could call a department that is actually trained to defuse this type of situation. But seeing as this is America, we obviously do not live in a perfect world. Sure, America's crisis response system for the mentally ill is admittedly improving. In fact, just this year, the US rebranded its mental health crisis and suicide prevention hotline under the number of 988, and states are encouraged to create mobile 988 crisis response teams that can be dispatched when necessary rather than involving the police. No relation. But the problem here is that the infrastructure required to have this resource run like a well-oiled PlayStation 3 is a long ways off. The logistics of running an operation like this on a state and nationwide scale is still a ways away. So no, we still have work to do, meaning that in the time being, the police have and will generally be the ones who respond to these mental health emergencies if an emergency responder is required on site. And sadly, historically speaking, that said response has been lacking. Due to poor training, the police often escalate and exacerbate the problem. Many mentally ill folks are arrested and often find themselves in physical altercations with cops. And to make matters worse, there are times where the mentally ill are shot and killed by the police, which is sadly unsurprising seeing as so many cops reach for their firearms at the slightest provocation. But the point I'm trying to make here is that many cops are trigger happy, and when you add the unpredictability of a person experiencing some mental health infused turbulence, as well as racial profiling, cops in the past have been very inclined to aim their shooty bang sticks at that said person, because when handling these situations, police often believe that their lives are in mortal jeopardy. Thus, the police designate the mentally ill person in question as a dangerous threat rather than someone with specific needs. And as a result, it's truly a system where human empathy for the mentally ill is absent, and is actually a reason why many people recommend not calling the police when someone is in a mental health crisis, because clearly many police officers can't be trusted to tactfully take care of the situation. Their methods leave a lot to be desired. This is very much like Elle's predicament earlier on in the season. Sure, she wasn't shot and killed, but she was ultimately arrested and viewed with critical disdain. She was mistreated and viewed as a public hazard by a set of cops who clearly did not know or care to appropriately respond to a young girl having a bad mental health day. A girl who could have used a sympathetic smile instead of being accused of nefarious wrongdoing. Very much like many other mentally ill folks in reality who have unfortunate run-ins with the police. If anything, the cops made Elle feel like a monster, which, let me remind you, is her gravest fear. That instead of being a normal teenage girl, she instead feels like a morally grotesque and broken creature, like a rancor with social abandonment issues. The cops only added to her trauma here. Unfortunately for Elle, things get even worse. If anything, Elle's mistreatment by government authorities earlier on in the season was just a taste of what was to come. See, Elle is being pursued by the US government's Colonel Jack Sullivan and his group of special ops soldiers. The rationale for this chase is that they believe that Elle is currently using her telepathy to murder the kids in Hawkins, mostly because these killings match the aforementioned violent incident years prior at that secret government Hawkins medical facility. You know, the massacre that was actually the result of Henry, or Vecna rather. But unfortunately, Sullivan and company believe Elle is the actual culprit, and from their perspective, Elle is a mentally unstable girl who is going on yet another rampage and needs to be stopped by lethal force. They believe she's dangerous and needs to be taken out back behind the Applebee's dumpster and put down. And worse yet, Colonel Sullivan has every opportunity to reconsider his stance on Elle. Later on in the season, Dr. Sam Owens even pleads for Sullivan to spare Elle's life, because where Sullivan sees a volatile public safety hazard, the reality is that Elle is just a traumatized girl and not a mass murderer. But of course, Sullivan doesn't listen. He's like a nerd at a football game. He doesn't give a shit, and thus he aims to eliminate Elle from the equation, all because he incorrectly believes her to be a societal menace, as a threat, which is sadly comparable to how law enforcement and government agencies all too often view the mentally ill. That, like Elle, we put the public in mortal peril. The mentally ill are painted in a negative light, both by certain specific characters in Stranger Things, but also in real life. In fact, mental health discourse in the real world has been plagued by politicization in the political sphere as of late. state, most notably in response to mass shootings, which is honestly something that does have a link with Stranger Things 4, but it's gonna take a bit of explaining on my part in order to make that connection. See, in response to America's decades-long endemic mass shooting crisis, certain politicians have placed the onus of these tragedies on the mentally ill rather than the ease of which guns are available, which is the actual problem here, not the mentally ill. Because blaming the mentally ill for this is wrong. Like the Sonic the Hedgehog movie's original design wrong. It's pure nightmare fuel, and scarier than Mitch McConnell. And sure, the argument that mass shooters are afflicted with untreated mental illness has kernels of truth in it, because of course most people that want to embark on a brief career of mass murder are probably far from mentally healthy, though statistically speaking, mass shooters also have non-mental illness related problems like a history of inflicting domestic violence or being radicalized into white supremacist bullfuckery. But this is besides the point, because mental illness isn't the main problem here. After all, other countries have mentally ill folks as well, yet those said nations haven't transformed their local McDonald's play pit into a literal potential war zone, meaning that something else is the culprit, leading to the excess of human suffering and death in this cursed, overly nationalistic land, which is to say, guns. You know, the fact that it's way too easy for anyone to buy weapons of mass murder in this country. But some Americans don't like to hear that. In fact, guns have become ubiquitous with the identity of a certain subsect of Americans. To them, guns are about as American as eating a hot dog at a baseball game or infringing on the rights of indigenous people. And according to some Americans, guns are just the way of life in the red, white, and blue. They're a God-given right written into law by the man-made Constitution. For many people, these weapons, which are machines specifically designed for killing things, are just a quintessential aspect of American life and death, and something that can't be revoked, just like Steve's perfect hair. And as a way to defend these weapons and the Second Amendment from which they stand on, many politicians are scapegoating the mentally ill. And make no mistake, we, by which I mean the royal we, are the scapegoat here. Though yes, I'm aware that there are some caveats. Sure, there is now overwhelming bipartisan support for potential good mental health legislation, like the Restoring Hope for Mental Health and Well-Being Act of 2022, which passed in the House of Representatives back in June, and according to the White House, the act would invest in crisis response and address mental health and substance use disorder needs in communities, which on a policy level is good. Expanding access to mental health care is always a positive. Additionally, the recent resurgence of horrific mass shootings this year lit a scorching fire beneath the uncouth ass of Congress in order to craft a somewhat bipartisan gun safety bill, though one that was way more heavily supported by Democrats than Republicans, that was later signed into law by President Biden. This law requires gun purchases to be processed through more rigorous background checks and such, but unfortunately does not all-out ban assault weapons and other items which are designed for literally killing things beyond the purpose of hunting or just being weapons used in self-defense. In essence, it is a compromised law, but still overall a positive step. But here is the thing. Positive incremental legislation alone isn't good enough. For one thing, some of these politicians that are now currently complaining about America's mental health crisis are doing so without acknowledging the fact that some of their policies beforehand actually worsened the whole situation, because obviously maybe defunding state programs was just bad governance. Greg. But extending beyond actual policy, there is a problem with the rhetoric. See, the rhetoric surrounding mass shootings often involves demonizing the mentally ill at large. After all, whenever a mass shooting occurs, the mentally ill are often thrown under the bus like animation creatives at Warner Brothers Discovery, because whenever these horrific massacres happen, it's only a matter of time until a politician or a television pundit places the onus of this tragedy on the mentally ill, meaning that over time, due to the rhetoric, people associate these acts of violence with mentally ill people. Rhetoric that is overall demeaning, yet unfortunately repeated ad nauseum, over and over again. It's like a broken record, if that broken record was also by Kid Rock. Through this messaging, the mentally ill are regularly portrayed as violent perpetrators, but this is the opposite of the truth. As stated earlier, the mentally ill are far more likely to be victims of abuse rather than the abuser themselves. And to extend this to the topic of mass shootings, the politically charged language that casts the mentally ill as a threat ignores ignores all the mentally ill folks who are not psychotic mass fucking murderers. And truly, the non-violent mentally ill, which once again is the majority of us, are often neglected by these politicians even though we really shouldn't be. Especially considering that mass shootings create points of trauma in those who survive them. Because obviously, the kid who ran out of school away from machine gun fire, or adults fleeing a 4th of July parade holding their children tightly to their chest are not fucking okay. They become trauma victims and are thus mentally ill as a result as well. And every single time these politicians trot out the argument that the mentally ill are a threat to public safety, they are ignoring at best and demonizing at worst literal victims of trauma and abuse, some of whose traumatic baggage may stem from surviving a mass shooting. Because let's be clear on that latter point, many mass shooting survivors will be mentally unwell following those horrific events. If anything, they will be traumatized, fitting into the mentally ill category along with the rest of us, because truly many of them will bear psychological scars for the rest of their lives. This is relevant to Elle's arc in Stranger Things 4. In fact, Elle is the survivor of a mass murder situation herself, one that is very much akin to a real-world mass shooting. And yes, before some of you might roll your eyes, the comparison is accurate. After all, the show had a content warning at the start of the season because the slaughter at the Hawkins facility, which included children, might remind viewers of the real-life mass shooting in Uvalde that was horrific even by America's mass shooting standards. And for this reason, the comparison makes sense, because similar to mass shooting survivors, Elle is traumatized after surviving a mass murder event. She has serious mental health baggage and has debilitating PTSD, and thus she deserves empathy. Yet Colonel Sullivan and the other members of the US government disagree. From their point of view, Elle is perceived like how certain politicians, pundits, and the public view the mentally ill in real life. They believe that she endangers them. Yet the reality here is that Elle is just a scapegoat. Similar to how many politicians avoid meaningful firearm legislation to curb mass shootings, Elle is a very convenient excuse as to why there has been an uptick in public violence in Hawkins. After all, the idea that a mentally unstable Elle is embarking on a murder spree is personally a more agreeable possibility than the actual reality where Vecna, a being that looks like Gumby's decaying corpse after being left out in the sun too long, is attempting to destroy the world. Like how the American right wing often blames mass shootings on the mentally ill alone, it is morally expedient for Sullivan and company to believe that Elle is the real culprit behind the murders. It's just easier to view her as the monster here. So to recap, Elle's primary conflict is a lot this season, and features many variables and nuances. On the most obvious end, it's a compassionate tale about a young PTSD-stricken girl who goes to a facility in order to rehabilitate herself by processing past traumatic events, also that she can access her superpowers again. But on the more sinister side, Elle's narrative journey is filled with many hurdles that interfere with both her treatment and her personal autonomy. She is imprisoned by Dr. Brenner for the quote-unquote greater good, and she is being hunted down by US officials due to how she is supposedly a danger to the American public. And these are all concepts that exemplify mental health and PTSD issues in the US. Sure, there are hospitals and people that will do everything they can to treat and help keep people safe, but there are always many incompassionate barriers that all combine to create a system that stigmatizes the mentally ill. It's a true problem that prevents PTSD victims and folks with mental illness at large from getting the best care that they deserve, and forces people to have to navigate a damn minefield. And in terms of Stranger Things 4, Elle has to do this maneuvering as well. She must receive the therapy that she needs, all while being confronted by doctors and a government at large that dehumanizes her, an apparatus that won't allow her to live freely. They view her as a monster, if you will. But here is the thing. Fuck that. No matter her struggles, no matter her pain, and no matter what others label her as, Elle is not a monster. She is a hero and a person who cares for her friends who are actively being endangered by Vecna. And not even her captivity at the hands of Dr. Brenner or being designated a public safety hazard by the US government can change who she is and what her goals are. She is an individual, whether anyone else respects that or not. This truth comes to fruition when Elle escapes from captivity at the end of episode 8. When Colonel Sullivan and his goon patrol show up and lay waste to the entire medical facility and its staff, Brenner and Elle, who is still collared like a dog who hangs out with the goth kids, depart via an OSHA-approved emergency exit towards the back of the facility. But unfortunately, Brenner and Elle are intercepted via a sniper in a helicopter. From there, Brenner gets shot more times than Boromir, and Elle takes on the helicopter even despite the fact that she is collared, and eventually force pulls it to the ground on top of all the other military-grade vehicles via a big-budget special effects explosion that was probably costly to the American American taxpayer. From there, a dying Brenner unlocks Elle's anti-telekinetic collar and releases Elle. And before bleeding out, Brenner explains to Elle that everything he did was for her own good, and begs Elle to acknowledge that she understands why he treated her the way that he did, which is something that she ultimately declined to do. This was a big character building moment for Elle. After all, Brenner has long been portrayed as an abusive presence, both in terms of how he was a parental figure who emotionally traumatized his child, as well as in terms of the aforementioned medical malpractice, where he forbade patients like Elle their freedom and from expressing their individuality. Two things that really do thematically overlap and form a Venn diagram that's basically a goddamn circle. It's all connected. Yet Elle essentially overcomes the manipulations of her harmful parental figure. While he did eventually unshackle Elle before his death, she does not give him the satisfaction of claiming the moral high ground when it came to the years of emotional abuse and imprisonment. Sure, Brenner pleads his case that it was all for the greater good, but that doesn't change the fact that that said greater good meant actively hurting and shackling Elle and many others, actively devaluing Elle's humanity. And rather than justifying his actions, Elle just tells Brenner goodbye, and thus turns her back on him. She is now beyond his control. Ultimately, with Elle's new freedom, she chose to be with her friends. After all, the whole reason that she underwent the treatment and symbolic hospitalization to begin with was so that she could be a quote-unquote superhero again. She desired to regain her powers so that she could combat the evil force terrorizing Hawkins and thus save the people that she cares about most. Throughout the season, Elle underwent the hard but necessary therapy so that she could be a whole and complete person again, even though there were clinical and social obstacles in her way, even though certain government entities viewed her as dangerous and lacking in mental stability. Because even against those barriers, Elle succeeded in getting the treatment that she needed. And with that, Elle has moved beyond what she was once labeled as. Elle has fully accepted that she is not a monster. To be continued in part 3. And with that was the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of Stranger Things 4 and this video essay in particular. Additionally, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto my Discord server, and $5 a month will allow you to pitch requests for essays that I can do in the future. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.